So, a few months ago, I started watching a TV show. It was aired about 10 years ago, but I never watched it, and it was called 24. How many of you have watched 24? Quite a few of you. Okay, so I'm a little behind. I know, this was like 10 years ago that the first one came out. So I'm only in season 3. And the premise, if you don't know about 24, the premise of it is that each episode takes place in real time. It is 1 hour in time that these characters are in. The entire season is a 24-hour time span that goes on continuously throughout the season. And so you get to watch a 24-hour time span. Well, in the show, the main character, his name is Jack Bauer. And Jack Bauer is an agent for the counterterrorism unit in Los Angeles. In season 3, he has a very hard job. And that is that they have found that there is a deadly virus that is going to be released by terrorists in order to kill millions of people. And so they have to put a stop to it. In order to do so, Jack goes undercover. But what's interesting is that his cover is very difficult because he has to work with people that already know that he was an agent for the CTU. And so what he does is he tries to earn their trust by breaking somebody out of a federal prison and instantly becoming a fugitive. And so then he's trying to work with these characters and like, no, I'm not going to trust you. You were an agent. He's like, no. I've left. I've lost everything and all that I want is a payday. So trust me. I am not with them anymore. I have gone rogue and I am just trying to get some money. And so eventually he earns their trust. Well, the audience knows that he still is in fact an agent. He's just trying to go undercover. But the people in the drama have no idea. And so they're trying to figure out if he truly has gone crazy or if he's really still an agent. So they had to determine his identity in order to determine if they were going to survive or not. If they're going to trust him, that could mean life or death for them, or at least prison. Well, you also have a person that you have to determine what you think about concerning their identity. And that determination that you make makes a difference between life now and all of eternity. Luke chapter 9, verses 18 through 36 is the passage that we'll be looking at. If you want to turn your Bibles there to Luke chapter 9. In Luke 9, 18 through 36, it confronts each of us with the question of, who is Jesus of Nazareth? What do you say about Jesus? And it also confronts us with how your answer will affect your life. So again, this is Luke 9, 18 through 36. I'm going to read verses 18 to 21 to start out with. Luke 9, 18. Once when Jesus was praying in private and his disciples were with him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "The Christ of God." Jesus strictly warned them not to tell this to anyone. So Jesus and his disciples are out in the middle of nowhere. And Jesus is praying. And the disciples are all hanging out around him. And some are trying to look spiritual, I'm guessing. And some are just cutting it up like a bunch of guys would. And they're just hanging around. And Jesus suddenly looks up at them and says, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" What a peculiar question. Would you ever ask people, who do people think I am? I don't think you'd ask that. You may ask, what do people think about me? Do they like me? Do they not like me? But Jesus doesn't ask that question. He says, who do the crowds say I am? Jesus was alluding to the fact that there was something different about him. That he was not the average Joe Jew. But instead that there was something specific about him. And so he wanted to see what people were thinking. He knew that people were beginning to draw conclusions, and so he began to ask them what kinds of things that they were hearing. Of course, many theories had come up, including that he was a resurrected prophet. So that was a pretty safe question for Jesus to ask. But then he zeroes in on the disciples and asks them specifically, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? Now remember, the disciples have been with Jesus for some time now. And so images began to flash through their minds of things that they had seen about Jesus. They began to remember the different parts of the things that he had done. So scene upon scene flashed before their eyes. One scene may have been when Simon's mother-in-law had been struck with a fever. She was deathly ill. And moments later, she now was serving them because of Jesus healing them. Hours after that, Jesus was out healing numerous people of sicknesses and diseases. And they watched as Jesus cast demons out of people. Maybe another scene was when Simon, James, and John were out late at night fishing. And they had been fishing all night long and could not catch anything. And then Jesus instructs them to put down their nets again. And so they willingly oblige because he's Jesus. And as they do so, they catch so many fish that they become overwhelmed with it to the point that the boats begin to sink. Maybe they're remembering when Jesus was preaching, how he taught with such authority, but that he would preach things that were so controversial and radical. Or maybe they remembered when the boy was raised from the dead right before their eyes. Or the time when he showed love to the sinful woman that was crying on his feet and wiping his feet with her hair. And yet he showed love to her even though she was sinful. Everybody knew that she was a sinner. But yet he loved on her and told her that her sins were forgiven. And then everybody there was like, who is this that even forgives sins? But I think that there may have been one event that may have struck them the most. They were out on a boat. And they were experienced fishermen. And yet they're out on this boat, and then the strong storm comes upon them and overtakes them. And it was so bad that the disciples, these fishermen, were scared. They were terrified. They were feared for their very lives. And yet there was Jesus, asleep, in the midst of all this. And so they woke him up and said, Lord, don't you care for us? Do something. And so he gets up and he rebukes the wind and the waves. And just like that, becomes like a sea of glass. And they ask, who is this that even calms the storm? Even the wind and the water obey him. Who is this? So Jesus is now asking for their decision. Who do you say I am? Well, impetuous Peter broke everybody out of their flashbacks when he responds, the Messiah, Christ of God. Matthew tells us that he actually says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. In the same gospel, Matthew records a response that Jesus gave to Peter. And he says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. Luke, on the other hand, does not want to focus on Peter. So he cuts all of this out. There's a whole lot more that Matthew records of what Jesus said. Instead, Luke does not want to focus on Peter. He wants to focus on Peter's confession of Christ being the Messiah. So he cuts all that out. And then the only thing that he says is that Jesus instructs the disciples not to tell anyone about Peter's conclusion. Well, let me ask you, what about you? If Jesus were to ask you today, who do you say I am? How would you answer him? Have you examined the evidence and made a decision? Do you believe that Peter was delusional or that he was right? About 100 years ago, there was a world-famous violinist named Fritz Kreisler. He was in Germany and he was going to travel to London to give a concert there in London. About 1 hour before his the boat was set to sail, he decided to just walk around a bit in Germany, playing his violin, just practicing a bit. And as he was walking, he came upon a music shop. He decided to go in. He's carrying his violin, and as he's in there, the shop owner says, "Can I please see your violin? That's a beautiful instrument." And so he says, "Okay, fine, just be careful." And so the shop owner begins to look over it, and then disappears into the back of the store. And Fritz is like, "Can I have my violin back, please?" But he's gone. And then all of a sudden, the shop owner comes back in with two policemen beside him. And one of the policemen says, "You're under arrest." And he's like, "For what?" He said, "You have stolen Fritz Kreisler's violin. This is his violin." And he's like, "I am Fritz Kreisler." He's like, "Yeah, whatever. You can't pull that over on us. You're coming down to the station with me." And he said, No. I have to get on a ship very soon. I'll tell you what, can I please just see the violin for a moment?" I'm like, "All right, fine." So then he takes it, and he begins to play a piece that he is known for masterfully. And it became very apparent that he was, in fact, Fritz Kreisler. And he says, "Now are you satisfied?" So the question is for you, are you satisfied with the evidence that Jesus has already given that he is the Son of God? Amen. If not, hang on, because you will see within this very passage that he is. But I want you to imagine the disciples' confusion. Jesus tells them all, "Do not tell anybody what Peter has just said." Imagine how confused they would be. Wait, why? If you are in fact the Messiah, shouldn't everybody know that? Why would we broadcast that? Say, "The Messiah is here. We've been waiting hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet he is here. Why can't we tell everyone?" Just imagine how confused they would be. But yet Jesus says not to. And before they can ask him about it, he goes on in verse 22. "And he said, 'The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life.'" He's going to be rejected, killed, and raised to life in 3 days. Now you notice Luke does not record any sort of response from the disciples. And this is the first time Jesus ever says anything about what's going to happen. There's no response. But I doubt that they were confused as to who the Son of Man is. He says the Son of Man must suffer many things and goes on. I don't think they're confused by that because Jesus many times had used that title of himself already to this point. So I don't understand why they were like, "What are you talking about?" Later on in the same chapter, in verse 44, Jesus says this to them, "Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men." But they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them, so that they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. So it's not clear why they don't understand. Obviously, it was hidden from them for some reason. But it is clear that Jesus knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there were a series of events that must happen. They were going to happen, and it needed to happen. It was God's purpose and plan for Jesus being there the entire time. You see, his identity as the Messiah was going to have an effect on his immediate future very quickly. But the effect of his identity doesn't stop there. It also affects each of his followers. In the next part, Jesus continues on, but he raises his voice. Look at verses 23 to 27 with me. "Then he said to them all, 'If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit his very self? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory, and in the glory of the Father and of his holy angels. I tell you the truth. Some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God. Jesus says, if anyone will come after me. You see, a decision has to be made if you're going to follow him or not. Why would one choose to be his disciple? Why would you choose to follow this man, to leave everything behind and follow him? Because of his identity. Because of who he is. And Jesus is so kind to actually give them an opportunity to make an informed decision by listing the implications of what it would mean to follow him. He gives 3 conditions for discipleship. The first one that he says is deny yourself. To deny oneself. You see, one's life would no longer be about them. It would be about Jesus. As humans, we naturally go for whatever we want. That's what our desires bring us to, or at least to what feels good. And so that's what our self draws us to. But Jesus is saying, no, you have to deny that. Instead, you have to take up my will and my teachings. So to deny oneself means to cut out the things that are selfish and that prevent us from doing what Jesus desires. So he says, deny oneself. The second thing that he says is take up your cross daily. I want you to imagine what the disciples must have thought when they heard those words. You know, the disciples, as they would walk down the dusty roads near towns, would come upon men that were hanging upon crosses in excruciating pain and dying. And that is the worst type of execution, of punishment that the Roman government had come up with. It was reserved for the worst of criminals. And yet Jesus is telling them, take up your cross daily. Imagine what they were thinking. What are you talking about? That's insane. What do you mean? I have no idea what he could mean by that. But he doesn't explain it. He just goes on and gives the third condition. Follow me. Follow Jesus. Leave your life and everything in it behind you. Lose your life and take on his. Now the disciples understood what that meant because they had done that. In order to follow him, they left the fishing behind. They left their lives, their families, their friends behind and just followed him. But they had made a choice and they knew the cost was worth it. Why? Because as they followed him, they were able to experience the miraculous time and time again. To see things that absolutely blew their minds. Well, after explaining the conditions, he then gave them the reasons to do that. First thing that he said was, if you're trying to preserve your life, you're going to just find loss. If you're going to preserve your selfishness, it's going to be just loss. Whereas releasing the selfish grip on life by doing what God desires, by denying yourself, by bearing your cross, is going to actually lead to abundant life. It's one of those oxymorons in the scriptures. And then he says, what good would it be to gain the whole world and all that it offers if it just means forfeiting oneself to God's judgment? And he also says that anybody that's ashamed of him, he will be ashamed of them in the coming of his kingdom. And he finally gives a very strong motivator. And he says, some would not even taste death without first seeing the kingdom of God. I doubt that they understood what that meant, but it definitely left a lasting impression. One thing that is clear is that the destiny of humanity depends upon one's relationship with Jesus. So being a disciple comes at a high cost. If you're going to follow him, you better be sure of his identity. Was Peter right? Well, the next event that Luke records gives a definitive answer. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with them. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to them, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud then appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice then came from the cloud saying, "This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. So Peter, James, and John were privileged enough to go out on a trip with Jesus alone. And they're up on this mountain, and they're hanging out, and Jesus is praying, and suddenly the extraordinary begins to take place. Jesus' face and his clothes become shockingly bright, blazing like lightning. And then Moses, the father of the law, and Elijah appear in radiant splendor like Jesus. Apparently the disciples had a hard time perceiving what was going on because their eyes were heavy with sleep. Perhaps they thought they were dreaming. Then as they began to pinch themselves, they began to realize that this was truly happening before their eyes. They began to really take in what was happening. Mark's gospel actually tells us that the experience was so intense that they were absolutely terrified. Imagine being there and seeing what that was like. As Peter's heart began to settle down, he began to realize he was really close to heaven. This was an amazing experience. So, should we build structures? Should we build some tents, God? Jesus, should we do that? So, I don't know why he was thinking that. Maybe he thought it would prolong the experience. Or maybe he was thinking of the Feast of Tabernacles, where the Jews would reside in tents to celebrate the sovereignty of God. But all that we do know is that Luke actually says that he must have been in shock, absolutely babbling, having no idea what he was talking about. But while he's babbling, the cloud appeared, chillingly engulfing them. I'm sure the hair in their arms stood up, and the goosebumps just covered them because they were terrified. Suddenly the voice spoke, shaking them to the core. "This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." As the cloud lifted, the disciples found Jesus to just be alone. In Matthew and Mark, they tell us that Jesus instructed the disciples not to tell anyone about what had happened. Perhaps it was because it would accelerate the attempts on Jesus' life. But as the 3 disciples gathered their composure, they began to think through what truly had transpired. Think about it. The Lord God Almighty, Jehovah Yahweh, had just revealed himself to them. And not only that, but he spoke. He spoke to them where they could hear his voice, God himself. And they heard it. And then he verified that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, that he was the Son of God. Jesus is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. There is no doubt. He is the Son of God.
Amen.
Imagine that the words that God spoke must have etched on their hearts from that day forward. "This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to So as they thought about that, what did Jesus say that they need to listen to? He had just taught them days before what it meant to be a disciple. And they knew that was going to be tough and daunting. But they knew that it had to be heeded because he is the Son of God. Because you see, this is what I want you to get. When the Son of God speaks, listen. When the Son of God speaks, listen. You know, discipleship is tough. The same is true for you. The same is true for me. But the evidence bountifully overflows that he is, in fact, the Son of God. The greatest evidence being that he died and rose again 3 days later, conquering over sin and death. But the evidence is there. And so if the evidence is there, then that means when the Son of God speaks, listen. In the beginning, I gave you an illustration from the TV show 24, where Jack had to convince people that he was no longer an agent. An interesting thing was at the exact same time, he had to convince people that were endangered that he was, in fact, an agent. So that way he could get them to safety. So he was trying to do both at the same time. But they had to listen very carefully and obey what he said if they wanted to survive. In the same way, we must not only listen to Jesus as if he is a moral teacher. We have to listen to him because he is the Son of God. And so we must obey what he says. Why? Because when the Son of God speaks, listen. So again, what did the Son of God say that needs to be obeyed? Deny yourself. What does that look like for you? What does that look like for me? Deny your selfish desires. Deny consistently demanding me time. Deny Netflix binges. Deny owning the latest and greatest at all times. Deny retirement as vacation from God's work. Deny hanging out with friends that drag you down spiritually. Deny yourself from social media, maybe having to fast from it so it's no longer the thing that you turn to first. Deny yourself. Secondly, take up your cross daily, which means to obey God no matter what he asks you to do, and no matter how tough it is. For example, honor your parents when you feel like they don't deserve it. Or if you come across a report that you have to do, and you realize if you speak the truth on this report, it could cost you your job, but you choose to tell the truth anyway. Or it may mean sharing the gospel with a friend, even though you know it may cost you that friendship if you were to speak the truth in love. It may be something as simple as getting to know your neighbor. Take up that cross. Taking up the cross means saying yes to God no matter what. Thirdly, follow Jesus by saying no to movies or reading a novel or watching TV this week, and instead using that time to show Christ's love by walking with a neighbor, visiting the homebound, or having coffee with a friend that is struggling. Follow Jesus.